In the summer of 1839, a Chinese official in the port of Canton ordered large trenches to be dug along the coast. He poured salt, lime, and water into these trenches. Then he gave an order to his workers: throw more than 20,000 chests of opium, taken from British traders, into these trenches. More than 1,400 tons of opium were destroyed in front of his eyes and mixed into the sea. The man in charge was Lin Zexu, and what he did that day would push one of the world's greatest empires into a war against the most powerful navy in the world. It sounds crazy. Can an extract from a plant make millions of people addicted? Can a government use it to bring another country to its knees? The answer is yes. And this story is not only about a drug. It is a story of greed, colonialism, and the fall of an empire. So how did it begin? How did a white liquid leaking from the seed pod of a small flower change the fate of the world? This story does not begin in China. It goes much further back to Mesopotamia. Around 3400 BC, the Sumerians living in what is now Iraq gave the poppy plant the name Hulgil. The meaning was simple: the joy plant. Sumerian tablets explained in detail how this plant was grown, harvested, and how an extract was taken from the poppy capsules. The Egyptians also knew this plant. Traces of poppy were found in the remains from the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. In ancient Egypt, opium was used as a painkiller and a sleep medicine. Some historians even suggest that the mother of Queen Cleopatra used opium to calm her babies. When we come to ancient Greece, things become even more interesting. In Homer's epic, the Odyssey, there is a drink called nepenthe. This drink, which makes people forget sadness and pain, is believed to be a mixture that included opium. The Greek gods of sleep, Hypnos, and dreams, Morpheus, were often shown holding a poppy flower. The word morphine that we use today comes directly from the name of this god. But the real journey of opium began with Arab traders. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, during the Islamic Golden Age, Arab doctors and traders saw opium as a medical miracle. They carried it east along the Silk Road. It reached India, and from there it went to China. During the Tang Dynasty, around the 8th century, opium first arrived in Chinese lands. At the beginning, just like in Egypt and Greece, it was only a medicine. It was used for stomach pain, diarrhea, and insomnia, and it was a respected but expensive substance on the shelves of apothecaries. For centuries, the situation stayed like this. Chinese doctors prescribed opium in small doses. The rich saw it as a special luxury offered to guests. No one could imagine that one day it would bring an empire to its knees. The real turning point came in the 17th century. When European colonizers brought tobacco from America to Asia, Chinese and Southeast Asian traders discovered something. When opium was mixed with tobacco and smoked, it created a much stronger effect. Soon, people stopped using tobacco completely and began smoking pure opium in pipes. This changed everything. When opium was swallowed, its effect was slow and the risk of addiction was relatively low. But when it was smoked, it entered the blood directly through the lungs. Its effect was immediate, and its addictive power was far greater than before. By 1729, the Chinese Emperor Yongzheng understood the seriousness of the situation and banned the sale of opium. But it was already too late. Demand had already been created. And where there is demand, there is smuggling. At this point, the darkest actor in the story appears: the British East India Company. To fully understand this story, we need to go back for a moment and talk about tea. In the 18th century, tea consumption in England was growing rapidly. In every English home, in every social class, tea had become an essential habit. But the only source of tea was China. And the Chinese emperor showed no interest in British goods. In his famous letter to King George III, he clearly said that China had everything it needed and did not need British products. What was the result? Britain was constantly paying silver to China in exchange for tea. And this flow of silver was literally draining the British treasury. This became a national crisis for the country. They needed a solution. They had to sell something that China would want. And they found it: opium. The British East India Company set up massive poppy fields in its Indian territories. especially in the Bengal region. They forced local farmers, often through debt and pressure, to grow poppy instead of cotton or grain. In large factories established in cities like Patna and Benares, thousands of workers processed the poppy sap and produced opium balls in molds. Each ball was carefully packaged and sent to warehouses in Calcutta, and from there it was shipped to the Chinese coast. There was a clever legal trick here. The British East India Company itself did not directly sell opium to China. This was officially illegal. Instead, it sold the opium at auctions in Calcutta to independent traders, who then smuggled it into China through networks along the coast. The company had found a way to do the dirty work without getting its hands dirty, and this system was incredibly effective. In the 1730s, the amount of opium entering China was about 200 chests per year. By the early 1800s, this number had passed 4,000. By the 1830s, more than 30,000 chests per year, about 1,500 tons of opium, were flowing to the Chinese coast. Now stop for a moment and think. An empire, to close its trade deficit, knowingly and willingly made another nation's people addicted as a business model. This was one of the most systematic drug trafficking operations ever recorded in history, and the side that carried it out was considered the most civilized empire of its time. If this story has surprised you so far, you are not alone. On this channel, we explore these dark but little-known parts of history, and there is much more to discover. If you subscribe, you will not miss stories like this. By the early 1800s, opium had spread into every level of Chinese society. At first, it was a luxury habit that only wealthy merchants and members of the royal court could afford. But as prices fell, opium became even more common. Soldiers, government officials, students, and even priests became addicted. In Canton and the nearby cities, opium dens began to appear. These were dark, smoky places where people would lie on long wooden beds and smoke opium for hours. According to one historian's estimate, by the late 1830s, between 10 and 12 million people in China were addicted to opium. In some areas, nearly 1 out of every 4 men was a regular opium user. The results were disastrous. Addicted farmers left their fields. Soldiers ignored their duties, and in some military camps, officers were even caught smoking opium. Families sold their valuable belongings, furniture, clothes, and even their children, to pay for opium. The economy was collapsing because the flow of silver had reversed. China was now paying its own silver to the British in exchange for opium. Wealth that had been built over many decades was quickly leaving the country. The Chinese court could no longer ignore this disaster. Emperor Daoguang was shocked when he learned that even some members of his own family had become addicted to opium. He decided that it was time to act. In 1838, Emperor Daoguang sent Lin Zexu, a strict and principled official, to Canton as a special commissioner. His mission was clear: destroy the opium trade completely. Lin Zexu began his work with great determination. He arrested local opium addicts, closed opium dens, and punished Chinese traders. But his biggest action was aimed directly at the foreign merchants. He surrounded the foreign trading district in Canton, stopped all trade, and demanded that British merchants hand over all of their opium. After months of tension, the British finally gave in and handed over more than 20,000 chests of opium to Lin Zexu. This is where the scene we described at the beginning of the story took place. Lin Zexu destroyed the huge supply of opium by mixing it with salt and lime in large trenches dug near the sea. The process lasted for 3 weeks. Lin Zexu saw this action as a great victory. He even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, asking why Britain banned opium in its own country, but had no problem selling it to China. The letter was morally powerful, but it received no response in London, because for Britain, this was not a question of morality. It was a question of money. And the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium meant an enormous financial loss for British merchants. The reaction in London was quick and harsh. The British government described the merchants' losses as an attack on free trade. In a vote in Parliament, the decision to go to war was approved by only 9 votes. This war would become known as the First Opium War. In 1840, the British Navy arrived on the Chinese coast. The fight was far from equal. While the Chinese army was still using bows, spears, and old cannons, the British brought steam-powered warships, modern artillery, and a disciplined professional army. The steam warship Nemesis almost destroyed China's coastal defenses by itself. The result was unavoidable. The Chinese army suffered one defeat after another. Shanghai, Ningbo, and finally the areas near Nanjing came under British control. In 1842, China was forced to sign one of the most humiliating agreements in its history, the Treaty of Nanjing. Under this treaty, China had to open 5 of its ports to foreign trade. It also gave the island of Hong Kong to Britain without a time limit. China also agreed to pay a huge amount of silver as war compensation. And perhaps the most humiliating part was granting a right called extraterritoriality. Under this system, British citizens who committed crimes in China would no longer be judged under Chinese law. Instead, they would be judged under the laws of Britain. Notice something important. The word opium did not even appear in the treaty. The war had officially started because of opium, but the peace agreement neither legalized nor banned the opium trade. Instead, the trade continued just as before, and even became larger. Historians call this treaty, and the similar agreements that followed it, the unequal treaties. They were agreements forced on a weaker country by a stronger one, without equal rights for both sides. Even today, this period is remembered in Chinese history as the century of humiliation. The First Opium War did not solve the problem. Instead, it made it even worse. The opium trade continued freely, and addiction in China became even more widespread. In 1856, an incident involving a ship called the Arrow was used as an excuse to begin the Second Opium War. This time, France joined Britain. The war lasted for 4 years, and the result was even more devastating for China. In 1860, the Allied forces reached Beijing and looted and burned the Imperial Summer Palace, a magnificent complex filled with centuries of priceless art, books, and treasures. At the end of the war, the treaties of Tianjin and Beijing officially made the opium trade legal. China had been forced to allow the poisoning of its own people, and this time it had to do so under the law. 11 more ports were opened to foreign trade. Christian missionaries were given the right to travel freely throughout the country. And China was forced to pay yet another large war compensation. The period after these 2 wars was nothing less than a disaster for China. By the 1880s, an estimated 15 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. This was about 3% of the country's total population, but it was a much larger share of the male population in the cities. In some regions, a large part of the best farmland was used to grow poppies instead of food, because opium was far more profitable than rice for many farmers. Economic collapse soon led to social collapse. The authority of the Qing dynasty was seriously weakened. People saw that their own empire was powerless against foreign countries. This loss of confidence helped create the conditions for major internal conflicts, such as the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864. The rebellion caused the deaths of an estimated 20 to 30 million people and became one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. Some historians argue that the Opium Wars and widespread opium addiction played a direct role in the fall of the Qing dynasty. That collapse finally came in 1912, bringing thousands of years of imperial rule to an end. The fate of an entire nation had truly been shaped by the extract of a single plant. At this point, it is worth asking one question. If you found this story interesting, you should also check out the other videos on this channel. We have many more stories about how ordinary objects and substances have changed the course of history. You can also tell us in the comments which topic you would like to see in the next video. China did not remain completely silent in the face of this disaster. In the late 19th century, a reform effort known as the self-strengthening movement began. Its goal was to modernize China by adopting Western technology and making the country strong again. New factories were built, modern weapons were produced, and students were sent to the West for education. But the opium problem continued to overshadow all of these efforts. By the beginning of the 20th century, both the Chinese government and the international community had to admit that the problem had become too serious to ignore. In 1906, the Qing dynasty launched a major reform that aimed to gradually ban both the production and use of opium within China. At the same time, Britain, under growing international pressure, and because of increasing feelings of guilt among its own people, agreed to reduce opium exports from India to China. In 1909, the International Opium Commission met in Shanghai. It became one of the first international efforts in history to control dangerous drugs. This meeting is now considered one of the foundations of today's global drug policies, United Nations agreements, and international drug control systems. After the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, China entered a long period of chaos. Different warlords fought each other for control of different regions, and many of them encouraged opium production again to finance their armies. The irony was painful. A disaster that had been forced on China by foreign powers had now become a tool used by Chinese leaders in their own struggles for power. When the Communist Party came to power in 1949, Mao Zedong and his government treated the opium problem as a matter of national honor. The new government launched one of the most aggressive anti-drug campaigns in history. Poppy fields were burned, smugglers were executed, and addicts were sent to forced rehabilitation centers. Within only a few years, opium addiction, which had damaged Chinese society for more than a century, had almost completely disappeared. It was one of the fastest and toughest anti-drug campaigns in human history. Its methods remain highly controversial, and many raised serious human rights concerns. However, the result was clear. A problem that had harmed China for more than 100 years was almost completely removed in just a few years. The Opium Wars officially ended in the 19th century, but the legacy of opium never truly disappeared. Morphine, which is made from the opium poppy and later heroin, created new waves of addiction around the world throughout the 20th century. And today, history seems to be repeating itself in a strange way. The United States is struggling with its own opioid crisis. What began with prescription painkillers later developed into heroin and fentanyl addiction. In the last 20 years alone, this crisis has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Some historians and journalists compare this crisis directly to the Opium Wars of the 19th century. In both cases, powerful companies aggressively promoted an addictive substance for profit. Regulators reacted too late, and millions of ordinary people paid the price. The difference is that this time, it is not empires that are being blamed, but pharmaceutical companies. Yet the basic pattern has not changed. Profit, addiction, and power remain closely connected. The story of the Opium Wars is not only the story of a drug, it is also a reflection of how power works. An empire decided that it was acceptable to make millions of people in another nation addicted in order to protect its own economic interests. And while doing so, it hid behind noble-sounding ideas such as free trade. For China, this period is still remembered as a deep national trauma. If you want to understand China's foreign policy today, its strong focus on national sovereignty, and its determination never to appear weak again, you need to look back at those opium-filled shores of the 19th century. The century of humiliation has become one of the foundations of modern China's national identity. Perhaps the most remarkable fact is this. Today, medicines made from the opium poppy, such as morphine and codeine, are still among the world's most important medical drugs. The same plant relieves the pain of millions of patients after surgery, while at the same time it continues to cause addiction and death around the world. Benefit and disaster exist side by side in the same flower. The next time you read the words Opium Wars in a history book, remember that they are not simply the name of a war. They represent the greed of an empire, the suffering of millions of people, and the long decline of a nation. If this story surprised you as much as it surprised me, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every week we share another little-known story that truly changed the world. And now I'm curious, which part of this story surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments.